watching the rocket take off and fly by the moon again is quite an incredible experience. It's lovely to see that. And I think what's been interesting in these somewhat troubled economic and political times is that that's the sort of thing that brings the world together, right?
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and real privilege to have Brett Roberts joining us again on the show. How are you, Brett?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be back again. We love these conversations.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Maybe you can remind listeners where you fit into this big wide world of tech and business.
Oh, you gods, I'm not sure. I've been in the tech realm for a few years, since the early 90s, I guess, and I spent 13 years at Microsoft, spent a bit of time at Callaghan Innovation, spent 5 years at Datacom. So not exactly a tech guru anymore. It'd be dangerous if I was allowed to touch anything technical. But I've got lots of opinions about technology and some of the folks in behind it. These days, I do a lot of work around business consulting, particularly helping senior leaders with AI stuff. And I'm doing some work now around customer value, which I've discovered is something that no one seems to understand. So go and have a look at my LinkedIn for my latest post, Paul.
Excellent. That sounds good. A big thank you to our show partners, to One New Zealand, 2 Degrees, Spark, Workday, Fortinet, and Gorilla Technology. Really appreciate their support of the show on an ongoing basis and the broader support that they give to the tech and innovation ecosystems here. Well, jumping into the New Zealand news, some pretty big things going on. First up, Peter Beck. He's decided to work effectively for nothing at Rocket Lab.
Yeah,
So he said, look, you can cut my salary back. I think he was on a US $800,000 salary, which is it's about 1.4 million with how weak our dollar is at the moment. And he's reducing that down to US $1 a year and forfeiting his stock options and redirecting the compensation into research and development to prioritize long-term innovation, shareholder value, and confidence in the company's future growth. I wouldn't have thought that Peter Beck would need to do that. There seems to be a lot of momentum behind the company, but maybe it's the current economy. Maybe he just wants to make it clear that he's all in and fully committed to Rocket Lab and its future.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting move. I mean, I admire it. I think it sends a really good message. I'd love to know what the message is behind the message, or what the motivation is behind the message. It's an iceberg, right? And there's a lot, I'm sure, lurks below the water level. But good on him for doing what he's done. Rocket Lab, geopolitics aside and all the other things, is an absolutely incredible success story, now a global success story. Have you ever been through their premises in Mount Wellington?
No, I haven't been through the Mount Wellington premises, and I interviewed him at their previous premises when we did a New Zealand Business Podcast interview, and we were sitting there in Mission Control, which was pretty cool. But I do need to go and check out the Mount Wellington premises, because I know it's a lot bigger and pretty awesome.
You need to. It's got the most amazing reception area of any organisation I've ever set foot into. For starters, I won't spoil the surprise, but it's pretty amazing. And being shown around where they're building all of the rockets, etc., at the back is just mind-boggling. My background is I'm an avionics engineer. I've spent some time at Boeing in my dim, dark past. Boeing back in the day was a really amazing engineering company, less so these days. But just seeing what they're doing there, the scale of it, and I don't know, you could eat off the floor, which I suppose is what you should be able to do in a rocket lab, but quite incredible. It was really inspiring. In good old Mount Wellington, there's literally a whole bunch of rocket scientists. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and they've also
so good on him. I think what he's done sends a great signal. I think it's good.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very, very good move, and they've also got their Warkworth location as well now, which they'd acquired from Sail GP. It was also
that's right.
the Oracle sailing HQ as well. So that's where they're doing some pretty big work when it comes to preparing for Neutron, and so there's been a few leaks of some of the footage there. But great to see things continuing to move forward on the Rocket Lab front, and just an incredible story. We'll tap in on what SpaceX are up to a little bit later on in the show, but also Rocket Lab's involvement in the Artemis 2 mission, which, as we record this, they've come around from behind the moon, so that's an exciting one.
Side of the moon. Yep.
Now, also New Zealand front, Spark have confirmed that they have gone live with Starlink satellite to mobile services. So that enables them to provide to their customers, messaging services, text, iMessage, WhatsApp, I believe, when their customers are outside of, normal mobile coverage, and also data services. And access will depend basically on the plans people are on, whether they've got immediate access or whether they will have to pay extra. Understand the extra element will be $10. So this is going to be fascinating just to watch how things play out competition-wise. Obviously, we've got One NZ that have really, led the way with getting involved in Starlink early on. Starlink's now a more mature offering for that satellite to mobile connectivity now, or it's further along in its track. But different price structures. And then, of course, we've also got 2 Degrees, coming with their partnership with AST Space Mobile, which is a different offering again with their, mega-sized satellites that are intending to, deliver, high-speed connectivity that we're not receiving at this stage from Starlink's satellite to mobile service. So it's going to be an interesting period ahead as all the carriers end up with competing offerings here.
I think it's quite interesting for a couple of reasons. So the first one is I still find it mind-boggling that that they've launched thousands of low Earth orbit satellites and built out such an incredible network so quickly. Really, I mean, if you and I were having this conversation 10 years ago, we'd have probably chortled at the idea of someone doing this. So, I've always made my opinions of Elon Musk pretty clear, but man, as a organization, their ability to execute, on a grand vision is just second to none. It's incredible. What I think is interesting, so the competition here in New Zealand is good. It's always good to see the telcos competing. One has to wonder how it's a fraught relationship, right? Because they're effectively, in dealing with an organization that can have global connectivity. The telcos are effectively introducing piranhas into their own paddling pool, right? From a competition perspective. So it's they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They have to do this. It's customer expectation, but by the same measure, each it's death by 1,000 cuts. I can absolutely see a future not too far down the track where we start to see the likes of Starlink and others bringing their own carrier services into the country. Where's the value that the local telcos add? So I think from a competitive standpoint, it's really interesting. It'll be interesting to watch the play between, terrestrial telcos and effectively, in orbit connectivity. I'm not sure it's going to end well for all the telcos.
I've had a bunch of discussions around that, and that is certainly a pretty common concern. I think in terms of the technology at this point, or the existing services certainly would struggle to get inside most buildings and to be able to deliver, connectivity and so on. But I think the telcos and their chief technology officers and their smart folks will have kind of delved into the details. But I think the general pushback at this stage is that's not possible. But who knows what the future holds and how this might evolve over the next decade or two. But I mean, certainly even going through a any sort of reasonable, tunnel in New Zealand where you can still get mobile connectivity, but you only get GPS if the GPS signal is being, effectively kind of regenerated inside the tunnel. I'm thinking the Waterview Tunnel in Auckland, for instance, where they, I believe that they generate a GPS type connectivity or type result there, so your phone thinks it's getting GPS, but can't actually directly get to a GPS satellite. So we'll certainly see how these sorts of things evolve. But there's probably some considerable complexities ahead. But look, we may see that happen. In some countries at some further point in time. Whether that would make sense, and I guess comes down to the technical possibilities, but then business-wise, would it make sense and so on as well? I don't know.
I think the interesting thing with that is, and because everything you've talked about there from a technical standpoint is exactly right. What happens the day that Starlink put an offer on the table to Spark or One to buy their infrastructure? Right? I think
Yeah.
So those are some of the interesting things I think that are coming down the path at some stage.
Yep.
Elon Musk is one of those everything is never enough kind of folks. So I'm sure that there's plans on the table to do something similar. We watch with bated breath and see what happens.
And there's also the scenario where satellite providers have had effectively free connectivity. So if you look at if you have a Starlink dish to get internet at home, it's not like Starlink have had to go out and spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a particular piece of spectrum as our telcos have. Yeah. That's effectively been made available. There's spectrum available for satellite comms. So
that's right.
Yeah, some interesting times ahead for sure. The other piece that caught my attention in terms of local news is the government is reallocating 122 million of existing science, innovation and technology funding to place stronger emphasis on emerging and advanced technologies. And this is interesting. So rather than kind of increasing their overall spend, they've decided to focus on some priority areas, quantum, robotics and genomics, with some focus on opportunities that they think New Zealand, has the potential to realistically develop some world-leading capabilities. So I think, this is an interesting one to look at. I guess, this has been part of your world in the past with sort of Callaghan getting involved in that side of, supporting new investment into innovation.
Yeah, I kind of run hot and cold on, well, not so much hot and cold. I'm a little bit torn, I guess. The fact that it's reallocation rather than, a boost in spending, I guess the first thing that popped into my mind was rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. That's not quite the right analogy, but it's shuffling cards around. It's that shell game, moving things around.
Hopefully New Zealand's not the Titanic, Brett.
Yeah, like I said, it wasn't the best of analogies. Yeah. It's not a good analogy day. So there was a few things. So I think the first thing is it's good to see focus. I think that's a good thing. We can't do everything and be everything. And so I think choosing to place some more major bets, I think, is a good call. I've been generally, on the overall scheme of things, absolutely appalled with the way in which they shut down the previous, I guess, ecosystem and infrastructure and left a big gaping hole, which caused, I suspect, a lot of our scientists and researchers and others to consider careers elsewhere. I think that's a real shame. I think we have lost some very bright folks and we're unlikely to get them back. So yeah, look, I think focus is good. I think spending the same as we were going to before, which was never enough, is not good. I think the way in which the transition's been handled is amateurish, substandard, but at least there appears to be a plan now. Although, having said that, my understanding is that also there's some more legislation that needs to be passed sometime later this year to get some of the other building blocks in place as well. So it's good to see that we've gone through, hopefully through the transition, and we're coming out of that. So I am optimistic that we're going to see some progress here, which is a good thing. And again, I think narrowing our focus, we could argue back and forth about what to focus on, but I think having some focus and being able to say no to things so that we can say yes to the right things is a very good thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although it's always tough for those that are impacted where funds are maybe just disappearing. But we want to make the very best shot we can when it comes to these investments. Now, robo-taxis and autonomous vehicles continue to kind of be in the media. Read recently that Waymo using remote operators based in the Philippines to assist when their robo-taxis in the US hit challenging scenarios such as complex traffic and accidents and the like, which is interesting. Although they did say that the human in the loop workers provide guidance rather than taking over a remote steering wheel, as such, which is
I've got a mental image now. Thank you for that.
Yeah. For those watching the video, you get a different view than just listening in. And then we've most recently heard that Tesla have admitted that their robo-taxis in some cases are being remotely driven by human operators at low speeds during emergency type situations. And it sounds like that's a little bit different from Waymo, where they are actually, you potentially do have somebody, with hands on the wheel from a remote perspective. So yeah, just interesting to have that out publicly. That's not something that probably many expected, particularly with how, Musk has really sort of, talked up the AI capabilities within Tesla's for a very, very long time, shall we say. And then this comes on top of news from China, where somewhere north of 100 robo-taxis from Baidu abruptly stopped in Wuhan. And wherever they happen to be, whether they're on a motorway or just typical sort of road, they stopped in traffic, and I think that created some cause for concern and a number of accidents as well. So that's the kind of thing when a vehicle just abruptly stops where you wouldn't expect it to. So all is not perfectly well in the world of autonomous or vehicles that look like they're fully autonomous. And sometimes there are some people that do the smoke and mirrors part.
This whole thing has been such an interesting thing to watch, right? There's two people in the technology world for whom I don't believe a single word that comes out of their mouth. And 50% of them is Elon Musk and the other half is Sam Altman, right? And Elon Musk has been talking this up for so long and basically not delivering. So when the story broke about the humans in the loop thing, like that was a completely unsurprising moment. Of course, there's going to be humans in the loop. They're late to the market. They don't have the same level of technology that Waymo does. They were always playing catch up, and they've got a liar at the helm. And so I was completely unsurprised at that. The thing in China was interesting, and it reminded me of something I saw. There's a great video on YouTube of delivery robots in Estonia a few years back, where they all congregated in one place and were arguing back and forth about right of way. So they were technically trying to move. They hadn't stopped moving, but they were just stopped because there was a whole bunch of them there and they couldn't work out who got to go first. I have a suspicion that we're going to see humans in the loop for this sort of thing to some extent for a long period of time, mainly because of American litigiousness, right? And I'm sure that the day that a machine without a human in the loop manages to severely injure or kill a human, would be quite a show, which has happened obviously, but be quite a showstopper moment from a lawsuit perspective. So I can see that having humans in the loop for two reasons: A, to sort out problems like that, and B, to have someone to blame is an important thing and will be for a while. I haven't been in a autonomous taxi yet. I would step into a Waymo. I'm not sure about Baidu in China, but I absolutely 100% would not ever step into a Tesla autonomous taxi. No, that'd be like, stepping into a home-built 747 to circumnavigate the globe. I would not do that.
Okay, so we know where Brett's at on that one. Oh, that's
I'm an
classic.
ex-aircraft engineer. Reliability means something, you know.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm still waiting on a Tesla to have the autonomous capabilities that it was going to get within 3 months of purchasing it, and
A long time ago.
here we
And
are.
then actually the other thing that's worth remembering too, just for the laughs, is that robot thing that Tesla did a while back, where it turned out all of the humanoid robots were controlled by motion capture or something remotely, which I just thought was hilarious.
We do see a bit of smoke and mirrors
They
in
do that
this
well.
area, don't we? So yeah, it's fascinating to see these things go on. I guess having seen Waymo's kind of freeze up recently when there was power or comms outage in San Francisco, and now to see this one in Wuhan, just highlights that there's a way to go in some of these areas to get to a more perfection type situation. But yeah, of course there's a lot of this stuff going on, and it's moving a lot slower.
Trucks, autonomous trains.
Yep. But now on to something also involving San Francisco-based companies, US-based company. Apple have turned 50 in recent days, which is quite it's a bit of a shock to me, but
yeah,
then,
me too, actually.
You grow
I'm
up with these companies, and you think, well, how can they be 50? I'm only hold on. So as you get older, you don't always feel like you're getting older, and you think of these as young upstart companies, but Apple has been around for half a century.
Quite incredible. I mean, really incredible when you think about it. And you look at the innovation that they've delivered to the world, and first of a kind innovation. I mean, one of the examples I use in some of the briefings that I give is, when they brought out the iPhone in January 2007, I think it was the best phone on the planet. They'd never made a phone before.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about the engineering that went into cramming everything that was in that little device, and also the smoke and mirrors that went on to making sure it made for a good demo.
Yeah.
But what an incredible company. And they've been innovative ever since. And I think the spirit of Steve Jobs still lives on in that organization in so many ways, I think. They've got kind of a someone to look to, or something to look to for the future, what they're there to do. It'll be interesting to see what the next 50 years looks like. I'm fully intending to stay around for it. So we'll see what they manage to produce. But I mean, it really is a truly amazing, innovative company. You look at the work that, what they've done share price wise over the last 10 years or so, it is absolutely incredible. So, I'm sure they've got a lot of life in them yet. Quite an incredible organization, life-changing, literally.
Yeah, well, they've delivered so many things that have stood out from what others in the market have sold. And I guess the other thing that defines a company is the things that they say no to. And interesting that Apple themselves, I believe, spent billions of dollars on autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, the work that they did in that front. And then, at some point must have come to the conclusion that, no, this doesn't make sense. We're tapping out. And, if they'd kept going, it probably would have been many, many, many more, billions in a direction. And, those that had said that they were going to deliver autonomous vehicles in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, 2022, et cetera, and Apple came to the conclusion, and it would be very interesting to know the insides on that, but all the suggestions are that they took it very, very seriously until they decided not to. And I guess the more time that goes by on this front, they potentially look, sharper and smarter than everyone else.
Than your average bear. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you think about it. Could you imagine Steve Jobs, some came said to him and said, we've got this concept for autonomous vehicles. They almost work. We just need to have a human in the loop. That would never pass the Steve Jobs test, right? So I agree with you. I think one of Apple's great defining characteristics is they know what to say no to, and they're willing to say no to it. As you know, I spent 13 years at Microsoft, and I think that's one of the things that Microsoft's challenged with at times. I think they chase a lot of bright, shiny things, and their efforts get kind of deprecated to a certain extent or diluted to a certain extent. I tell you, one of the things I do think is going to be interesting to watch is Apple with artificial intelligence. I think watching the likes of, Sam Altman and others burn hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of shareholder cash buying GPUs effectively and building out data centers, which are currently under huge amounts of threat from Iran, I think Apple's play or strategy in the space might prove to be a very interesting one. I think there's going to be a great opportunity for vulture capital to come in after some of these have crashed and burned. And as we know, they've got handsets in the hands of billions of people around the world. And it's that connection from the hand to the eyes to the head that's potentially going to be the most valuable connection in this whole thing. So I think watching how they play in this domain, I would never write those folks off. They're pretty sharp and they're strategically, at the top of their game.
Yeah. I was looking back over some of their sort of their history and things that stood out. The Apple II, which they launched in 1977. I remember, the schools were full of those.
Yep.
Not the school I was in, but it was, it was very, very common for across New Zealand and lots of parts of the world. And that was, I think, quite a critical entry point for Apple with enthusiasts early on in that education sector, where they were able to win some market share. 1984, when the Apple Mac launched, and their iconic Super Bowl ads was poking fun at IBM and so on. And then it was only about a year after that Steve Jobs actually left Apple in 1985. I didn't realize it was so soon until I was looking that up, and 12 years later until he returned when Apple acquired his company Next, and that was kind of when things really started heating up for Apple. Microsoft helped Apple there with an investment when they were really, really struggling. But from there on, things started moving pretty swiftly. The iMac in 1998, but there were also products that got cancelled and kicked to the curb and so on that I guess Jobs recognised were distractions, weren't the right thing to have said yes to. And then iPod, iTunes, the iPhone that you mentioned, the App Store. In recent years, Apple have done very, very well with their M series chips that started out having their own chips for their phones and their iPads and so on, but putting those into the Mac. A real stroke of genius that's enabled them to be very, very competitive. And even this new Mac Neo that has launched in recent weeks, it stands out for innovation and value, and just an impressive product. It's an example that they can keep doing new things and doing well.
Yeah, like I said, they're a truly inspirational company, and I'm sure they will continue to bedazzle us with innovation, in the future. It's deeply woven in their DNA. And I think that whole thing about focus and being willing to say no, I think that's a critical part of it. Have you ever read Walt Mossberg's biography of Steve Jobs?
Yeah, I think it was probably a few years ago now.
Yeah, it's a very good book. And it really does give you an insight into obviously who he was, not necessarily the nicest of human beings, but certainly one of the smarter ones, and why that company is the way it is. And I think under Tim Cook's leadership, he's done a stellar job, launching them into the next phase of their, or the current phase of their growth and success. So
yeah. And those early Macs, I mean, were just so genius from not just the graphical user interface and the mouse, but the industrial design and the that really sort of set a standard in the industry that it took decades for others to start delivering things at that level. And still, I think Apple still, stands out as the leader when it comes to the design, not just of their hardware. It's every other element. I had to laugh the other day, and I probably shouldn't mention this, but I got sent a review device, we'll say from another manufacturer. I won't mention who. And when Apple gives you a device to review, if it's in person, they'll unveil it in a similar way to the way Jobs would unveil something, with kind of pulling the cover off it and so on. And if they send you a product, they send you the product exactly as a purchaser, would get it completely unopened. You get the whole experience of the unboxing and so on. This other device arrived in a kind of a, maybe it had been to one or two people before me, and there was, a bit of bubble wrap and a stuffed box, and it was just night and day. Just showed you the difference in the DNA and the thinking and the pride in the product.
Yeah,
and that sort of seems to really carry through with Apple. I wouldn't say Apple that I like everything Apple will do. They're a business, and they're very, very successful commercially, and sometimes that leads to things that aren't always popular. But I think generally speaking, they've been a real positive impact on product design and innovation, and I'm very interested how that will continue over the years ahead. I think to be able to do something on an ongoing basis. I mean, they've been around 50 years, and what they've achieved over this last 50 years is impressive. I think there are probably one or two products that some of us would query whether they should have said no to. The Apple Vision Pro, which hasn't even launched in New Zealand, is that a slam dunk? I don't think so. But generally looking at their products, they're as outstanding as you say. So very curious how it rolls out from here. That's for sure.
Let me tell you a quick story, because I think it really plays into this quite nicely. So it must have been 2008 or thereabouts, while I was still at Microsoft. I was responsible for the company's outreach to the open source community here in New Zealand, right? So I was kind of the bridge between Microsoft, the evil Microsoft, and the open source community. And I made some really good connections in the open source community, had some really good arguments with folks. It was great. It was a really interesting time. And I had lunch one day with somebody who's still in the tech scene here in New Zealand, in Auckland, and he'll know who he is if he happens to see this. A very strong advocate for open source software and hardware, and very eloquent and articulate with that advocacy kind of thing. Anyway, we're at lunch, and his phone rings, and I realise it's an iPhone. And I said to him, hang on a minute, how can you, a strong supporter of openness, open source technologies, how could you have an iPhone? One of them, it was a closed device, certainly back then, very, very closed ecosystem, etc. It's the antithesis of everything that you stand for, everything that you advocate for in the open source community. And he picked the phone up with two hands, and I remember this vividly over the table. He picked the phone up with two hands, and he held it out in front of me. He said, Brett, every time I use this device, it brings me joy. And I remember, like, literally at that moment thinking, nobody else, if you can convince a very staunch open source advocate to use your device, if Apple could convince that, nobody else had a chance. Microsoft never had a chance. The others don't have a chance. It's quite incredible. And I will always remember that. The value in that product for this person overrode all of their concerns around openness or lack thereof, or whatever it might be. And I think that speaks absolute volumes for the power of design and understanding your customer and building something that the customer doesn't just like, but loves, that brings them joy.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting, because every listener will have their own preferences in terms of brands and so on, and their own experiences with Apple, and I'm sure that varies, but hard to throw stones at what they've achieved, and just how much their products have stood out over the years. Now, the first crewed flyby of the moon in over 50 years, the Artemis 2 mission. Yeah, pretty. It's been pretty exciting to sort of watch the launch and now the footages, the most recent footage, from going right around the moon is online. The furthest humans have ever been away from Earth, pretty historic moment. And very pleasing to know that Rocket Lab are responsible for the solar that is keeping the Artemis crew powered up. So I thought that was nice to hear. I was curious about that because I'd be going back over 4 years now that they made an acquisition on the front of Solero Holdings, who are a key supplier of space solar products. And I think there may be 3 kind of key companies in this area, and so I was curious. And then over the weekend there was a tweet from Rocket Lab to announce that it was their tech keeping the Artemis 2 crew powered up on that incredible journey.
Quite amazing. Like, I'm a child of the Apollo generation, right? I can remember sitting in class listening to, was either the launch of Apollo 11 or Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon, one or the other, so that dates me a bit. So watching the rocket take off and almost visit, fly by the moon again, is quite an incredible experience. It's lovely to see that. And I think what's been interesting in these somewhat troubled economic and political times is that that's the sort of thing that brings the world together, right? And I think it's quite an inspiring image to see, us exploring the outer reaches of space, or our little bit of it again. I tell you, an interesting thing that I popped up the other day was how much secondhand space shuttle gear has gone into the Artemis program. I had no idea. It's really surprising. Yeah. I think
there was quite a bit of debate about whether that was the right approach to take, but it was the approach that they took, and quite to actually see it in action. Was kind of quite a shock, really, considering it's quite old kit.
Yeah, it's from the 80s, right? The other thing I think that's interesting with this too is to see. I mean, the Artemis program has taken a long time to grind to the point where it is now, and then you look at the likes of SpaceX and Rocket Lab in particular, how comparatively quickly they've gone from, starting out to where they are today. And it's been interesting just to see that, effectively a government-funded program really doesn't have the luxury of failure in that sort of domain. Whereas, if a SpaceX rocket blows up on the launch pad every once in a while, or a Rocket Lab one does, it's we'll learn from our mistakes and we'll move on. So just seeing how the private sector can move at pace, because the expectations are kind of different, has been interesting as well. But it'll be interesting to see what happens from here with Artemis. I'm not sure, but does NASA have any money at the moment? I'm probably going to have to run a cake stall or something until Trump goes. But
we'll wait and see. But the idea of having people, go to the moon and build a space base and so on in the years ahead, I think is probably going to reignite a level of interest in space that that we haven't seen for 50 years. So really encouraging. I think that they've been successful so far, and all the best to the crew that they splash down successfully in the next few days ahead.
And I think just one last thing is, you look at what it's taken to get where they are now, all the hard work, and you look at the innovation that SpaceX and Rocket Lab have brought to the equation, 3D printed rocket engines and all that sort of thing. It just highlights again what an incredible achievement the Apollo program was back in the day, being able to get a couple of guys onto the moon and one circling around it using, the equivalent of a, 1960s Ford car is quite amazing.
Yeah. It is mind-blowing when you think of how much technology's advanced that they just did not have access to, back in the 60s when that program developed, and how quickly that they actually, they pulled it off. That in itself, you were talking around, the time to to get the Artemis missions happening and so on. But I mean, they moved at an insane pace when you think about it. That is hard to get your head around it. And yes, that meant that there were lives lost in the process. It was a much riskier endeavour then than it is today. And certainly the modern kind of tech firms of move fast and break stuff. I think that probably applies a bit more to SpaceX than it does to Rocket Lab on the break stuff front, shall we say? But interesting times ahead.
Disassembly, I think, is the term.
That's right. Yeah. For SpaceX, who we've been hearing for a while that they're filing, for an IPO, an initial public offering, getting themselves listed on the stock exchange. Varying bits of news media bouncing around that saying that they've confidentially filed for this IPO. Some reports suggested a $2 trillion valuation, but I see Musk has jumped online and said that's not true. But the suggestions are that they're looking for investment of around $75 billion, which is a huge amount of cash to be raising. But when we look at the momentum of what SpaceX have achieved to date, you can imagine if anyone can pull off that level of investment, then it could well be SpaceX. And it's going to be fascinating to see what the future holds for them. Of course, they've made recent announcements and some of it partnership with Tesla around insane mega chip building factory capabilities and data centers in space. Hard to know what of it to believe, and when it will come to fruition. And I think for those that have been following aspects like autonomous driving from Tesla, there may be some that are a little bit lacking in confidence, but there are certainly a lot of people that have made a lot of money out of Musk's investing in Musk's businesses to date. So I think there's quite likely a pretty big future ahead on this one.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. When it comes to who to trust, I think the easiest thing to do is probably not trust anything Musk says, data centers and space and all the other things. But the team behind him with SpaceX are obviously absolutely incredible from an engineering and delivery perspective. So I have no idea what will happen with the IPO. Musk probably needs an IPO. I suspect I can see Tesla, and I know their demise has been talked about for a long period of time and not actually happened. But I think Tesla are a little bit behind the eight ball when it comes to car models and things at the moment. A lot of his personal wealth is tied up in it. So a $2.1 trillion IPO would be quite a handy thing for Elon Musk right now, I suspect, from a personal finances perspective, help him balance the books. I have no idea how you value a company like that. I'm sure there'll be a lot of folks that would be very keen to get on board, although the current kind of world economic and political climate, I think, will make things interesting. And also a lot of the revenue for SpaceX comes out of government contracts in the United States, which I suspect that if a more legitimate regime were to run a fine-tooth comb over, might not necessarily be viewed the same way that the current American regime does. But, all things being considered, I'd be really surprised if they didn't launch I'd be amazed if it wasn't the largest IPO, or certainly top 1, 2, or 3 in all time. There's a lot of interest in it. They are the future. They're doing some really innovative stuff. It's clearly quite an amazing team. Yeah, we'll wait and see.
Yeah. No, I'm fascinated. And look, in most of these areas, Musk's companies, get there in the end.
Yeah.
I guess I call out the full self-driving as I'm impacted by it directly, but an incredible track record and incredible achievements there. Lastly, before we finish up, Anthropic have been doing incredibly well with Claude code. The Microsoft have licensed this now for inclusion in Copilot and through their varying AI platforms, but they accidentally leaked something like 500,000 lines of source code for their Claude Code AI tool due to some sort of a misconfiguration. Now, it doesn't give every aspect, away of their model and so on. But still seems like a reasonably large mistake to be making.
Someone's going to get a bad review, right? I was intrigued. I thought that was quite the misstep. I've switched over to Claude in the last couple of months or so, I guess, and given up completely on ChatGPT, I'd have to say. And I've been really, really impressed. And I'm not a heavy user. I don't do any coding in it yet. I might do. It would probably be a very dangerous thing, but I use it for writing and some other bits and pieces, and it does a stunningly good job. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people doing a bit of soul searching and reconsidering their career prospects after that. That was a real screw up. I'd love to know the story behind that, but which I'm sure we never will. But But they're doing well. And I thought the Microsoft thing you mentioned too, in passing, I think that's interesting as well. Microsoft are kind of hedging their bets. And I think that OpenAI Microsoft relationship is a very, very different beast than it was 6 months or certainly 12 months, 24 months ago. So
I think
stuff happen in that space.
Yeah, very savvy move on Microsoft's part to to partner with the top firms and have access to the best models. I think there's an aspect where, from a usage perspective, everyone wants to use whatever is flavour of the month. If it delivers the best result, that's what folks want to be using. But organisations also need to make sure their data governance is in order, and that's usually a whole lot easier to do if you're using tools from a key vendor like Microsoft, rather than tapping in, say, Claude into your SharePoint and into your email and bits and pieces. Certainly that's probably common thinking.
I think you raised a really good point, right? And I think Microsoft are doing some really good stuff around the governance side of things for enterprise users. I have no idea what their AI strategy is. It's all over the place. And we spoke earlier about the whole everything's called Copilot. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we woke up tomorrow morning and they'd rename the company Copilot. So I think that's shambolic, but their work around governance, etc., for enterprise customers, I think, is world leading. So it's quite funny. It's quite a, what's the word I'm looking for? Dichotomy. I'm not sure what the hell they're doing overall product strategy wise, but they are doing some of the best stuff out there when it comes to, protecting customers around all of the governance side of things. So we live in very interesting times in the AI world. It's just literally every day there's something that's both eye-opening and shocking.
And news that we didn't announce on the show last week, I think it kind of came out around the time we were recording, that Microsoft New Zealand Managing Director Vanessa Sorensen is moving on. So that's big news. She's been a real stable force and and a really key part of the company for.
She's done an amazing job, and she's a wonderful human being. I've worked with her, met her many years ago. And she is an extremely good human, and she's done an amazing job for Microsoft, and I'm sure whatever she turns her hand to next, she'll do a stunningly good job of that as well. So interesting to see what happens, actually, how they manage all of that.
Yeah. Well, that's us for this episode. Anything else you wanted to add, Brett?
No, not really. Thank you for having me again. It's always fun. If people want to find me, you can find me on Twitter @BrettRoberts. I'm also on Blue Sky with the same name. Lots of opinions, some of them informed, most of them probably not. Or find me on LinkedIn. I like talking to people a lot. So if you found any of this interesting, please get in touch. Love to have a conversation. And thanks again, Paul. Really enjoyed this as always. So.
The very talented and self-deprecating Brett Roberts. Thank you for joining us again. And of course, a big thank you to our show partners, Fortinet, Workday, Spark, 2 Degrees, 1NZ, and Gorilla Technology. So, hey, thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll be back again with another episode next week. And, feel free to get in touch via email or social media if you've got any comments on the episode. Great to have you listening in. And thank you again, Brett. Always enjoy your insights and opinions. And you keep us on our toes with some good insights.
Thanks, mate.
there. Yeah, it's great. Awesome. Thank you.
Take care, Paul.
Cheers.
See ya.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.